Thank you. So I'm Jeremy Fricke, and I'm Education Director at Tri-Faith Initiative. And I am going to share my screen here. So you are here for Making the Familiar Strange, that we're calling Let Them Have Their Share, about Lot and Melchizedek. And I'm probably going to change how I say Melchizedek a whole bunch of times because everyone seems to say his name a little bit differently. But this is part of a series that we do on a variety of topics here. So today we're going to go through some of the goals of this program and some of the ground rules. We're going to do a quick timeline of the content that we're going to kind of discuss or go over today. And there will be a variety of discussion over particular questions that are raised in the context of the stories. This specific run through, I'll also do a little bit more teaching when we get to Melchizedek, because I find that a lot of people are not as well versed on some of the background of that character in the Hebrew Bible. So we'll get there soon. So our goals for this program are really to study Abrahamic scriptural stories alongside each other. The idea here is that we want to learn a little bit about the traditions that are, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in particular, and really be able to compare and contrast kind of different narratives. And through this process, I hope to encourage perspective taking. A lot of the stories that we go through are fairly familiar, or maybe you've heard of them, maybe you've read them before, but we're hoping to kind of help provide some tools to be able to look at these stories from a new point of view. So some ground rules when we have some discussion here. Please be as respectful as possible, of course, and challenge your own assumptions. And one ground rule that I think is a little more difficult to follow sometimes is, really try your best to speak from your own point of view. Even if we are all part of different religious traditions, we often have, slightly different perspectives than maybe the next person. So try to speak from your own point of view. And for this discussion, there is no wrong answer. So we will be looking at the different perspectives and really trying to find, what do we find meaningful out of these texts, out of looking at these texts from different perspectives. So I'm also often asked about what I use for translations. And I use a variety. I also will sometimes use the Talmud or other associated sources, but I do use the JPS translation of the Tanakh, use a few different translations of the Hebrew Bible plus the Greek Bible. I also use the 5 books of Moses for Genesis in particular. He does a more, historically motivated perspective. And then when I use the Qu'ran, I usually use Sahih International. So just to give some context, especially in case you didn't get a chance to read it, we're going to start, this specific program will be over chapters 13 and 14. And so we begin 13. This is shortly after the Egypt story with where Abram speaks to the Pharaoh, and he's there with Sarah or Sarai. But shortly after, Abram and Lot visit Abram's original altar. And I'm calling him Abram because he hasn't been renamed by God yet in the story. Abram suggests that they divide the land that they're near. His altar is very close to the land that he receives. And then the opportunity is actually given to Lot. Lot chooses to dwell near the cities on the plains, specifically Sodom, and Abram chooses Canaan. And then God speaks to Abram after Lot has left and promises his seed to be like the dust of the earth. And then in chapter 14, we are introduced to a whole bunch of different political figures, a whole bunch of different kings, and they are all in conflict. Lot is kidnapped. Abram goes and saves Lot, and then near the end here we have Abram is blessed by the king of Salem, which is Melchizedek, and attempted to be paid by the king of Sodom. So a lot happens here. But this first section with Abram and Lot will probably focus more on discussion, and I'll do a little extra teaching for Melchizedek. So one other piece here before we get started is usually I try to interweave the Muslim narratives about these stories. These particular stories have less overlap with the Quran or the Hadith. There are some arguments about certain characters in the Quran having overlap with Melchizedek, and there are stories about Lot. But when we get to Lot, I think it actually makes more sense to talk about the Islamic narratives about Lot when we get later in Genesis. So this time we're mostly going to be discussing Jewish and Christian perspectives, but if you come next time, we'll actually be centralizing Muslim perspectives through stories about Hagar, and Amal Alexander from AMI will come to talk about kind of women and Hagar and Islam, and then we'll have some discussions about that as well. All right, so let's start with a really broad question here. What is the purpose of unity, or what is the purpose of division? Throughout this program, I'll ask if people would like to read. I always appreciate if people would volunteer, and I'll read this one, but keep in mind that please volunteer as we go through. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at this time. So it seems like in Genesis that there is purpose to both unifying and dividing. What are some of the purposes of unifying?
So Jeremy, that's a question to start with, right, for us to start a discussion. I mean, one thing just practically is that the story of Lot getting kidnapped happens after they divide. So you could say that practically there might be a safety issue there in unity, even if there are some other practical considerations we see here that mitigate against that.
That's true. That's true. That's a good point. He does get kidnapped when they divide. Would anyone like to add to unity, or what is the purpose of division? I also am reminded a little bit of how the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, we see a narrative where the people, to some extent, are trying to unify, and God performs actions that divide. And this idea kind of comes back a few times in Genesis, including here, arguably. So some of this division, we see a few things that I've underlined here. The land could not support them, right? So when we have, especially at this time, when we have too many people in one place, we get a problem with resources, and resources are a serious issue. And the conflict does arise to some extent when we're all together. I don't know that that's always a bad thing, but there's a little bit of conflict. And then the Canaanites and the Perizzites. So they're surrounded by people who are not necessarily part of their group. So they seem to find that conflict is happening when they're too much together, and they don't want to be in conflict when they're surrounded by the Canaanites and the Perizzites. At least that's how I seem to read it.
Yeah, it's interesting to wonder how much they're trying to encroach upon the land of the Canaanites or Perizzites. Maybe spreading out allows them to sort of slowly take some of those fields, or whatever it is that they're using, grazing areas.
That's a good point too.
I mean, it may simply mean that there wasn't enough land because there were these other groups there, but it does seem like this is a narrative of Abraham and his people spreading out over time.
Yeah, for sure.
There's also the point about division or separation, which keeps people on track and not assimilating, but staying within the boundaries of their own faith.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. Yeah. So this overcrowding, it does seem to be an issue, and we'll discuss that a little bit more as we go. But because I think a question that a lot of people go through, especially with these first few chapters of Genesis, is why does it seem like too much unification is a problem? So a little bit earlier in the chapter, Abram and Lot return to where Abram built his first altar. And this place is between Bethel and Ai. Would anybody like to read these couple verses?
I will.
Thank you.
The place between Bethel, house of God, and Ai, heap of ruins, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord.
Mm-hmm. So Bethel literally translates to house of God, and Ai translates to heap of ruins. So Abram's original altar is between these two places. What would you say the significance of returning to this altar is? There's always the geographic significance, but let's look a second at how these translate. I mean, this feels significant. I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways to look at it, but why is an altar between the house of God and a heap of ruins? And why does he return to it, really? So, I mean, a couple things here. I think I've heard from a rabbi before that this is in part to symbolize the human connection, that humans are basically halfway between the house of God and the heap of ruins. Their connection is right down the middle of those two, sort of that material and spiritual world. Does anybody else notice anything in particular?
I'm trying to sort of look at the chapter before this, because right, he's returning, right? He's sort of going back to the beginning in a way, but I'm not sure what the symbolism is there. I'm just saying that, this is kind of right after Abram first gets called to leave his country and his father's house, and then he goes and builds this altar. And then he just continues on down. He ends up in Egypt, which is where he first passes his wife off as his sister. I think that's the first time.
Yeah. Yes.
There's 2 or 3 stories about that in the
yeah.
text. And then, and then he just comes back. So I mean, he got some wealth along the way, but I haven't read enough exegesis of these passages to, like, is there some kind of return thing here that's a thing? I'm just not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either. I mean, I just raise questions, but it's interesting. This is a reused altar. This is the altar that's between the house of God and the heap of ruins. I think that's something worth thinking about a little more. Let's see. So Jean suggests, is he returning to a place where he spoke with God before? Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, maybe. I think that's he probably is. I mean, in part that's got to be part of it. All right. So, and in general, does God appear to like urban or rural development more? Would anybody like to read this? I know it's a little longer, but would anybody like to read this?
I can read if you'd like.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan toward Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The 2 men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord.
Yeah. So, what do you notice about the way these locations are discussed? And does it seem like God has a preference between urban or rural life?
Well, certainly in this passage, the cities are wicked and the rural land is lush.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Yeah. And like the previous section, I mean, the Tower of Babel, it can symbolize a city. So I want to point out a couple extra things that in this specific passage. So number one, okay, Abram is usually the main character, right? In general, Abram is the one who pushes the narrative forward. Just before this, Abram basically says, Lot, you can choose first, and I'll choose second. So the narrative switches, and Lot becomes the main character for this. He chooses a significant part of where this story goes, right? Lot looks around. Lot chose for himself. Lot lived there, right? So it's very important to the narrative for Lot to make this decision. And I can't tell you exactly why, but to me anyway, this section really shifts how basically the history of Abraham's line goes because of Lot's choice. I also want to point out here, Lot sees that the plains are watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. And what are you reminded of when you think of the garden of the Lord and the land of Egypt? So you can argue whether those are the same place or whether it's a reference to like the Garden of Eden or something. But what do you think of when you think of the Garden of Eden and Egypt?
I think a watered land was very valued and rare, it sounds like, and kind of a precious place.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
They both end up being places that you have to leave.
Yeah. Yeah, they're temporary. Temporary green. Yeah. So it seems that the text is reminding us where this narrative about Lot is going. Lot chooses for himself this place. There's clearly an attraction to fertility. That's an important thing, but also there are many fertile places. There's arguably a choice for picking Egypt and the garden and or the Garden of Eden, depending on how we look at it. So and you can see there's like 3 or 4 reminders in a very short amount of time that Sodom and Gomorrah are going to get destroyed, right? Don't forget this. Don't forget this is going to happen. This is important for the rest of this narrative. So, and then there's also a reference to dust here. So would anyone like to read this right side passage first?
I will.
Thank you.
I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the reason I add these passages on the left is that this is the 4th time that dust comes up in the Genesis narrative, and these are the other contexts. Would anybody like to read those 3?
Sure, I'll do that too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and the Lord formed the man from dust. To the serpent, you shall eat dust all the days of your life. From dust you came, to dust you return.
Right. So I mean, and I don't have an answer for this really either, but why is Abraham's offspring related to dust here? There's other times where Abraham's offspring is related to other things like stars, but in this circumstance, it's dust.
Well, dust is a very humble thing and plentiful, and you can't even probably separate the particles of dust. They're so small, but everywhere. And the stars, of course, are anything but humble. So that's a good comparison.
That's interesting. I like that. Kind of that balance between humility and righteousness when you compare the dust and the stars, basically. Anyone else have any particular thoughts about why utilize this this word, this image? I mean, I do want to add that there's I forget the name of the rabbi, and this is this is a sad interpretation, but there have been sermons written about the Holocaust in association with this. That sort of the 1316 and then the 319. The sad part, if you will. Let's see. And it is definitely the numerousness. That is the on its face way to understand this specific passage too. Is the number is uncountable. But yeah, I don't know.
Dust is also the source of creativity. You know, that's where everything comes from.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the Lord formed the man from dust, right? It's all kind of related in that. Oh, sorry. All right. So if anybody has anything in particular they'd like to discuss about Lot and Abram at this point, we can do that. Otherwise, I'll move on to Melchizedek in particular. All right. So at the beginning of this chapter, we have, again, a whole bunch of kings introduced, a little bit out of nowhere. They have a battle, and the side with Sodom lose, and they're plundered. Lot is kidnapped by the winners of that battle. But then Abram goes and saves Lot and sort of saves the day for that side of the battle. Now, I'm just giving that context because there's a lot of like warring there, and there's a lot that you can look into about like the etymology of those kings' names and things like that. But I'd like to focus a little more on kind of the aftermath of those battles, and in particular how Abram meets with the king of Sodom and Melchizedek. So now, Melchizedek is a very mystical figure in most traditions, most Abrahamic traditions, especially Judaism and Christianity. So there's a surprising amount of art about him for really having about 3 verses in the Hebrew Bible, and really only one. He comes out of nowhere. There's a lot to be said about him. But I'll go through a couple of these things. So firstly, his name. So Melchizedek literally translates to righteous king or king of righteousness. It can also be understood as my king is righteous. There's also an interpretation that suggests that he says, my king is Zedek, which is actually the name of a Canaanite deity, which we'll come back to a little bit, because I think it'll make more sense once we look at the actual verses, but we'll come back to that a little bit. He's introduced as the king of Salem, which Salem is usually translated as having a root from the word for, shalom or salam, peace. There are some people argue that he is the king of Jerusalem because of the Salem root, and some argue that he is the king of Sodom, and it's a renaming because of basically because of the relation of Sodom to the opposite of righteousness. So this character is very important, but the place that he is a king of is named differently for him because he is so righteous, right? And he is introduced as priest of God Most High, or El Elyon. Again, so this is the introduction of that name of God in the Hebrew Bible. El Elyon is also another name for a Canaanite deity. A lot of deities in this area of the world would have names that would translate to things like righteous or king, or things like that. So there is some overlap with that. There isn't a whole lot of consensus on exactly what this would mean. And we'll come back to a little bit of this with the verses. And then, so he's introduced as a priest of El Elyon right away, right? And regardless of what you believe about that, priest of God Most High, he's a priest before there's really even a priesthood, right? He's introduced as a priest before, before Aaron, before Levi, right? And there's been a wide variety of discussion among Abrahamic groups. Well, how does he get the priesthood? And so much of his mysticism is really surrounding that part. How is he a priest of El Elyon without coming from nowhere, right? So there's been quite a few Jewish splinter groups who have interpreted him before the advent of Christianity. Quite a few Jewish splinter groups would interpret him as a messianic type figure, because he's a priest king. He seems to be implied to have very mystical powers. In Gnosticism, we see a similar thing. Gnostic Christianity, we see a kind of an understanding of a pseudo-messianic figure. Quick overview. Gnosticism basically would believe that Christ can come in many bodies, and one of those bodies could have been Melchizedek. Modern Chabad actually teaches that Melchizedek is is Shem. So Shem is very righteous, and he has a priesthood from being the son of Noah, right? A bunch of Christian theologians have also interpreted Melchizedek as sort of a messianic type figure, or like a what's the word? I guess like a precursor to messianic figures. And the Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, they have actually their administration has multiple levels of priesthood, and one of them is the Melchizedek priesthood. There's the Aaronic and the, based off Aaron, and then the Melchizedek priesthood. Okay, so I know I just threw a lot at you all at once. Firstly, are there any questions about this before we go to the next slide?
I mean, I think this is really interesting, Jeremy. I kind of wish I had read more about it at sort of other times in my life, because I'm sure there is, like you're saying, there's a lot of different possible interpretations here. And you mentioned, this kind of idea of how was it that he became a priest. Is it weird that he's both a priest and a king at the same time, or would that not be that weird?
That would be weird too. At this time, and even really in the context of the story, kings are bad at this point, by and large in the Hebrew Bible. And they're associated with conflict and corruption and all that stuff. And this is someone who is a priest king. Yeah, I mean, it is odd, but he's given a lot of credit in the very short time that he's in that story.
Yeah, it also does kind of seem to say, in line with some of the discussion you had about his name and thinking about gods, is that it feels like part of a transition period from understanding Abram's God to be sort of potentially one among many, or the God for Abram and his group, but not for other groups around. Like maybe Melchizedek actually has a different high God or God that he's associating with. And yet, the story, it's kind of moving towards God being God, the God, capital G. Abram's God is the God of the earth as a whole. So it's kind of interesting to see the text, at the time it was written. I don't know what the writers were thinking in terms of that kind of like transition, but it's interesting to see that like kind of happening.
Right. Yeah, no, this is a character that is absolutely fascinating to me because there's just so many layers in such a small section. So let's look at some of the text that refers to Melchizedek. So would anyone like to read the section on the right, which is the part that's in the chapter today?
I can read it.
Thank you.
You said it's on the right?
Yeah, read the right one here.
Okay. Hold on. I'm going to have to adjust everybody because my webcam is blocking. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of El Elyon, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth. And praise be to El Elyon, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then he gave him a tenth of everything.
Mm-hmm. So I want to point out a couple things, and I want people to ask questions if they have any particular at any time during this point. But number one, I use El Elyon just to not have a clear opinion on that. That's just the term that's used in the Hebrew Bible. It's usually translated as God Most High. Couple other things. So at the very end here, then he gave him a tenth of everything. So the early rabbis with the Talmud and the Targumim, they almost always interpreted this as Abram giving a tithe to Melchizedek. And you'll see in most translations, it'll just say that. It'll say, and Abram gave him a tenth of everything, or something along those lines. The literal words are, then he gave him a tenth of everything, but it's majority of people interpret it as Abram giving to Melchizedek. There is room for some argument about that. And it does change the story quite a bit, depending on who gives a tithe to who. But again, most of the early rabbis would have interpreted this as Abram giving the tenth to Melchizedek. So there's only one other time in the Hebrew Bible where Melchizedek is referenced, and that's in Psalms. I'll read this one. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And most people interpret this as being toward David, sort of seen as the author of Psalms. It doesn't clearly define it. So we have something that Laura brought up, where, priest king, right? This is a reminder, okay, David can be a priest king because Melchizedek is a priest king. And although it's quite a bit longer, so I'm not going to read it, but in the Greek Bible, Paul, or the author of Hebrews at least, argues that Melchizedek is very much like Jesus, and makes an argument that Jesus's priesthood actually comes from Melchizedek. He actually basically does a almost like a micro sermon about Melchizedek and Jesus in those chapters. So, you can feel free to read that if you'd like. Some of what I've said today has some overlap, like Salem being, or King of Salem meaning King of Peace. Those are fairly common things, though. So there's a lot of ways to interpret this passage here on the right. If we want to take the kind of most one of the more traditional sense of Abraham giving Melchizedek a tenth of everything, then what do we learn with this interaction? This is the first tithe. This is an interesting situation for Abram and for this priest king.
It is weird. I just saw, I think Jean said something about it in the chat. Why did he deserve it? It's weird in a way because it sort of comes out of nowhere. I mean, you could read it as essentially a tithe and say, well, the priest is sort of blessing and honoring Abram, and that's one of the things he does in his function as priest, and maybe just by nature of sort of being a priest and doing his functions, he's entitled to this tithe, or it's basically sort of keeping whatever priesthood we're talking about sustainable. But yeah, because it sort of comes out from nowhere. It's like, did Abraham know this, or Abram know this guy before? Like, did he accept his priesthood? Did he? So it's a little bit, I guess because you've had a little bit of a story of these different kings, you might say, well, there's connections or ties within this region, and so maybe these kings all do sort of know each other, and there's it's not quite as out of the blue as it makes it sound in the text, but it still is a little weird. It's like it's like a Monty Python, like random women lying in ponds, tossing out swords or whatever, right? Like it's like priest is wandering along and being like, here you go, you're blessed. He's like, great. So I assume there probably is in fact more to it than that, but it does seem like, gosh, why does he even accept the blessing, right? Like what's
I mean, Salem is not even mentioned before this point. Like it's not part of the conflict between those kings, and I think, one of the more recent interpretations is that Salem and Sodom are the same, but that's a religious studies perspective. So a couple things here, I want to kind of tie in a few of those groups that I talked about a little bit earlier. So one in particular, so Chabad, or more Orthodox Judaism, would interpret. So again, Melchizedek would be Shem to them. Shem makes a mistake here. So the big mistake that Shem makes is that he blesses Abram before he blesses God. And by doing so, he passes the priesthood onto Abram instead of keeping it for himself, basically. Again, that's their interpretation, just as one way to look at this. So you notice that he does bless Abram first. My personal, thank you, by the way, Jean. My personal way that I like to read it is actually that Melchizedek is a priest of Elyon being an alternative deity, but let's look at this next passage, because Abram speaks again, and I'll show you why. Would anybody like to read this this section on the right? Here, I will. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "With raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, 'I made Abram rich.' I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who went with me, to honor Eshcol and Mamre. Let them have their share." I also, just as a side note, when he says, "With raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord El Elyon," he uses the name of God for Lord there. And follows it by El Elyon, which is not how Melchizedek refers to God. So I'd love to hear what everyone notices firstly about this interaction between Abram and the king. And just to give a little bit of context really quick. So timeline wise, Abram's about to meet with the king of Sodom. Then there's then Melchizedek comes out of nowhere, blesses Abram. And then we go back to the king of Sodom. And this happens.
The fact that please do, go ahead.
Is it just a contrast between lack of morality going on in Sodom versus Abraham's?
I mean, it's a good point. It's clear that, the text wants us to be reminded that Sodom is no good. They're corrupt somehow. Yeah, so he takes to some extent. You're saying that he takes the high ground, if you will, by not accepting gifts from corrupt king. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes.
Yeah. And what else do we see here?
I wouldn't have thought about this before, but when he says, "Give me the people," I'm not sure if that means Abram's people. I'm not sure what it is, but it kind of seems as though there's an argument over who gets to either, I don't know, continue to be related to in some fashion or rule over the people who have changed hands as a result of all this fighting.
I mean, that's a very good point. I don't know either. I mean, the only people that were clearly named is Lot, right?
Yeah. And then these three men who went with me, but I assume that that's just Abram's, his army or whatever.
Yeah. His top warriors, I don't know, or commanders.
So based on the text, it's not totally clear to me whether Abram is saying, "No, I'll keep the people, you keep the good," and sort of reversing that, or whether he's saying, "I don't want anything at all."
Right. And the question also is raised, what is the share for, I think it says the number, I think it says 318 people go with him, right? These three are named, but what is the share for the men who went with him anyway? So, I mean, but I think we do see a good example of leadership, right? Where he passes off the reward to the people who kind of did the work for him. He's given sort of he's sort of given credit for commanding, but he's passing off that credit. So one thing I want to point out kind of about the deity thing, and this is my interpretation. I don't know who else's it is, but so my interpretation is that Abram is seeing Melchizedek's deity as the same deity. So he blesses Abram with El Elyon, who's the creator of heaven and earth, who did this, right? So he's showing a certain level of monotheism in this circumstance with this deity. This is my argument again, no one else's. With this deity El Elyon. And Abram implies that, well, these are the same. He says, with raised hand, I have sworn an oath to the name of God, El Elyon. So this is really the first exchange where Abram uses the term El Elyon for God. And he combines those two. He says that these are the same. He says, Lord El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth. So he reflects that same thing. It kind of reminds me a little bit of a lot of monotheistic dialogue, actually, where we have two people who may have slightly different interpretations of a monotheistic deity, but they might be able to agree that they're different points of view on the same one. I think we see a little bit of that here, actually. That's my view. And, from then on, this becomes a name for the one God of Abram. So we see that arguably this is sort of the first interfaith dialogue in the Hebrew Bible. That's my argument. I do want people to argue against me if they want to.
Yeah, I have to go back now and see. I don't know if there's parts, before these chapters where people are actually talking about deities. I mean, you get a sense that there are different communities with different gods potentially, but whether they actually talk about that, I'd have to go back and do some reading. Yeah. I mean, probably when Abram went down to Egypt, he probably ran into people who were different, doing things differently religiously than he was. Right. Probably, but yeah, like you said, it's if you dialogue in terms of like literally talking about religion and talking about God, I actually don't know.
Right, and obviously, we don't see a lot here. I mean, they basically say two sentences, right? But that's an option.
So is Abram then an inclusivist in the sense that or what might even a stronger word than that? He's taking in all the other gods and just being like, nope, sorry, it's all my God.
I think kind of, at least that's my read of it, but I know that that's a controversial read among many. But yeah, I mean, I think he's saying I see my God in what you're saying, basically. That's just how I read that. Yeah. I think one question, and this is a question that I'm going to be looking at when I look at this story again, is, how does it change the story if Melchizedek is the king of Sodom? That's not, that's not what it says on its face or anything like that. But I don't know, especially in the context of all the other things that we've talked about. What does that even really mean? Oh, all right. Well, I would love to have any discussion about anything that anybody noticed. You know, did any of this ring true or false? Or, you know, do you have any particular questions that you'd like to discuss with the group?
One piece that I think is interesting that, and it is because it comes out of sort of both Hebrew and Greek, is this kind of order of Melchizedek thing. You are a high priest, or something about a high priest in the order of, and just having now, you know, looked at this and then I looked it up real quick while we were talking. It made me realize that that could be, I guess, a simpler statement than I realized, that it could simply mean not in the order of Aaron. That it just means a priest who's outside of that kind of, maybe it's wrong to call it more traditional line, but that kind of line of priests within the community. So I was like, well, you know, you could actually then clear up the mystery a little bit and just say, well, it's not actually that big a deal. I mean, can't, right? Depending what you mean by a big deal, but it's not quite so mysterious to be like, ooh, Melchizedek, you know, he's such a strange figure, or whatever. You know, it could just simply mean a priest who's not in that line of priests.
Yeah.
Which of course is interesting, because then there can be such priests, but.
Right. It just opens new questions.
Mm.
Well, I mean, otherwise, we're basically close to time. I want to thank everybody for coming. I actually, if here, let's